Hello, I'm Communications Officer Nia Douglas, and thank you for joining us for this very special edition of the Deputy Governor's Monthly Message. And I'm joined by the Deputy Governor himself, Mr. David D. Archer Jr., and today we're going to be discussing the elections guidance notes for public officers. So starting off, I'm just going to have the Deputy Governor introduce himself for everybody, even though he probably doesn't need any introductions. And I'm going to ask him right off the bat, what do you need to know if you're a public officer during elections?
The first part is easy. I am David D. Archer Jr. I'm the Deputy Governor of the Virgin Islands. What do you need to know about the elections guidance notes? The first thing is public officers. The Constitution, Section 23, allows you to have freedom of expression, freedom of your opinion, and is not restricted. So this means you can take part in active elections and express your views, express your concerns, but the conversations about the guidance notes speaks more to how it's done and who should do it when and where, and more importantly, how senior officers should conduct themselves during this period.
Okay, so that means that senior officers will have to abide by the notes in a different way than officers that are under them. So why is that?
Yeah, for example, I think it's important to give the examples of, let's use a policy. If I'm a senior officer responsible for putting together a policy or implementing a policy, then I have control of it. I know the details of it. Therefore, that's my job. So my job is to implement that policy. What I should not do is publicly criticize the very work that I'm doing. That's one part. Secondly, for the next officer who is involved in information, who might know information, therefore should not say, well, you should not vote for this candidate because I have evidence in my own office that here's what was taking place. So what you're doing now, you're crossing over between a conversation about the elections and actually breaching your clause of being confidential within the public service.
And of course, we have to take an oath of confidentiality, so we are still bound by that.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so when it comes to officers who are not senior, what are the limits to what they can do, if there are any?
Yeah. So it is a discussion which we always use examples. Therefore, can you say I support this candidate? Of course you can. Should you say I support this candidate over the other candidate because this candidate is A, B, C, and D, and probably use explicits or aggressive language? What happens, what that does, it brings your whole reputation. It could bring the public service into disrepute because you are a public officer, and especially if you're speaking from authority. So the guidance that we give is express your opinion. Be mindful that we have an apolitical public service. Therefore, any minister should feel confident that your work and your actions is not influenced by who they are or whether or not you voted for them. The confidence should feel consistent during the election period and also outside.
Okay, and I noticed in the guidance notes that there's a section about media. Can we talk a little about that and how that affects public officers, both senior and otherwise?
Sure. Well, that's a very expansive question. However, when you transition to what you call the election campaign period, the resources, for example, of government are utilized for normal government business. So you should not see resources being utilized on someone's actual political campaign. In terms of the media or yourself, how you work, you should see factual information about government's work, not necessarily facilitating a particular candidate, or in this case will be a minister in their political campaign.
So when it comes to talking to the press and the media, is it okay for public officers to speak to members of the media regarding the elections?
Ask me in a different way.
Let's say it's me, for
Yes.
example. Is it okay for me to be interviewed and asked which candidate I support?
Of course you can. The first question is, in what capacity are you being asked? Therefore, if you're being asked as your official in your official government capacity, then you have to be mindful of what was said before. If you're at a rally and someone says, what are your thoughts, what are your preferences, then you could express your preferences and your thoughts. But you have to be mindful that you're not being interviewed, let's say, in your official government capacity and going into very detailed conversations about politics and preferences. And is a thin line between how you express your freedom, and that's why the Constitution, 23(3), allows for certain restrictions on public officers. So as someone who has direct control over policies or someone who has information, I am more accountable to what I say and how I say it. Now, you might say, well, it's my personal opinion, it's my personal page. You can imagine if I post something on my page, for example, and that post with my foundation creates a public outcry about politics or selections of whichever candidate, you have to be mindful that your single voice, while expressing, doesn't evoke or spark another national conversations about political preferences. That's especially critical when you're at the very senior level within the public service.
Okay, so if officers want to review the code, the guidance notes more closely, how can they find it?
Well, we sent it out via email, and you should have a circular, but I will ask whether or not it's currently online, but you can always contact the Deputy Governor's office. We'll send you a direct copy. Or just ask a question. It's not a clear-cut conversation. You might be concerned about certain areas. Just ask the questions. We said, for example, we do not want public officers to be the persons who are nominating candidates. The reason for that is you want to ensure that in their day-to-day duties, they're utilizing their work not for the benefit of a particular candidate, but also just to implement good government practices.
Okay, so we touched a little on what was the purpose of these. We talked about having confidentiality, ministers feeling comfortable, and other people who are elected into the government feeling comfortable that we will do the work unbiasedly, obviously. Yes. So for persons who might feel like you're restricting me or infringing upon my rights, what would you say to that?
First thing, open your Constitution. Section 23. You have a right to be a part of the electoral process. It's your democratic right. You should explore it. All we ask with the guidance notes, it's called election guidance notes for public officers, is to give you a guide of how to conduct yourself during this space of time. But it's not a restrictive dialogue. It's a dialogue to ensure a apolitical public service, but also providing you with the right information to consider when you're having dialogue. Something as simple as, it's my own Facebook page. Why can't I say whatever I want? Well, you're not a public officer only when you're on the job. You're also a public officer when you're off the job. So it's not about how you utilize your voice publicly or privately. It's how you utilize your voice overall, especially on social media platforms.
Okay. Well, once again, I'm Communications Officer Nia Douglas, and I've been sitting with the Deputy Governor, Mr. David D. Archer Jr., as we discuss the elections guidance notes for public officers. Deputy Governor, I'm going to ask you to close off with one last message to the public officers, reminding them about these elections guidance notes, where they can find it and why it's important.
Yes. Thank you very much. First of all, your Constitution allows you to express yourself. That means being very much a part of the electoral process. It's not restrictive. We do ask in doing so you consider the guidance notes to give you guidance of how you should conduct those actions, especially for senior officers, heads of departments, permanent secretaries in conducting your business. So it's your guide to how you conduct yourself and how you be part of an open, fair, and honest electoral process.